Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman has the evening off. On the show tonight,
find the defendant guilty.
Former police officer Derrick Chauvin is found guilty in the murder of George Floyd. Two attorneys react to the verdict. And crowds in Minneapolis approve of the outcome today. We'll have reaction from Chicago.
Don't test us.
National Guard members arrive here in Chicago. We talk with city council members about the Chauvin verdict and the city's efforts to prepare for it. How music venues that survived the pandemic shutdown are reopening and dealing with a bungled rollout of federal aid.
Certainly it's disappointing.
As Mayor Lightfoot shoots down rumors floating around on social media, we talk about how to combat misinformation. And Stitches in Time. An exhibition blends music, history, and fabulous fabrics at the Art Institute. But first, some of today's top stories.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty.
Guilty on all charges. That's the verdict of the jury in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derrick Chauvin, now convicted of murdering George Floyd. Chauvin, who kept his knee on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, showed little emotion today as the verdicts were read. He was found guilty of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, and now faces up to 40 years in prison. And we have more on the reaction to the outcome of the trial coming up shortly. A group of Latino lawyers are calling on the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate the fatal shooting of 13-year-old Adam Toledo by a Chicago police officer. The group says it wants Mayor Lori Lightfoot to accelerate the implementation of a consent decree aimed at reforming the Chicago Police Department.
Faith and trust in the police department are in short supply in the Latino community. An objective investigation conducted by the Justice Department will send a message to our community that this time is different, that this time their voices will be heard.
The coalition includes leaders from the Hispanic Lawyers Association of Illinois, the Puerto Rican Bar Association of Illinois, and Pilsen Law Center. Illinois health officials report more than 2,500 new cases of COVID-19 since yesterday, and 9 more people have died. The total case count in the state now stands at more than 1.3 million and 21,694 total deaths. So far, more than a quarter of Illinois residents have been fully vaccinated. And Chicago health officials drop neighboring Wisconsin from the city's travel order, though officials still recommend avoiding non-essential travel. Visitors from the Badger State and others seen here in yellow are not required to quarantine for 10 days or record a negative COVID test prior to their arrival here. Visitors from states in orange are still required to do all those things. Last summer, Chicago saw massive protests after the killing of George Floyd, including some with violence, property damage, and theft. Chicago police, city officials, and local businesses have been preparing for the verdict in the trial of former officer Derrick Chauvin, with the mayor saying police were ready to ensure the right to peaceful protest and to stop any criminal activity. Amanda Vinicky joins us now from Daley Plaza. Amanda, what do you see out there?
Well, Paris, right now I'm pretty much alone at Daley Plaza. Even the once plentiful pigeons appear to have flown away and left. But up until about an hour ago, there was an event taking place just behind me with people carrying posters saying things like "Jail Killer Cops Now" and "Stop Cop Terror." Also briefly chanting justice for George Floyd. That was, by the way, briefly drowned out by the sound of helicopters overhead. It was a fairly small turnout and a couple of dozen participants, with one demonstrator calling it both a protest and a celebration.
Derrick Chauvin would not have been found guilty if not for the mass protests that have occurred throughout the year. If not for the mass mobilizations and people taking the streets, we would not see any semblance of justice. And so that's why it's important for all of us to be out here in the streets, to being organized, because they won't actually create that sense of justice without a demand.
And more demands, more mobilizations on the way, she expects, including hoping for turnout in some capacity tomorrow. That's when the Chicago City Council will meet in person for the first time, as activists who are present at this event tonight are pressing for Chicago aldermen to adopt an ordinance giving civilians oversight of the Chicago Police Department. Now, Mayor Lori Lightfoot had been prepared for much more massive demonstrations on a much more massive scale, something along the lines of what Chicago saw last year when there were some peaceful protests, but also a lot of looting. She wasn't the only one preparing for this. Driving around downtown, saw some buildings boarded up. Some may also be because of COVID vacancies, but I'm across the way see a bank that right now appears to be embracing the calm, expecting no other major activity anytime soon. They are taking down plywood that one can only imagine was just put up for the reason of waiting this verdict. Now, also at the mayor's request, Governor J.B. Pritzker had sent 125 National Guard members to be in Chicago on standby, and the mayor had said that CPD officers were given refresher course trainings on First Amendment rights and that they'd otherwise been preparing for demonstrations.
Don't test us. Don't test us. Hold on one second, let me just finish. We are ready, we are prepared, and we are ready to arrest and bring to prosecution anyone who would dare try to take the dreams of our small businesses by looting. Don't test us, because we are ready.
Now, some aldermen and some activists did take umbrage with that remark. Alderman Carlos Ramirez Rosa saying that the National Guard cannot bring peace, only justice can bring peace. Since the verdict, Mayor Lightfoot releasing a statement praising the Chauvin decision. Today marks a moment where future generations can look back and see that we as a nation came together and rightfully demanded justice and accountability. And justice was served. Governor J.B. Pritzker also reacting to the decision, saying, "My heart goes out to the family of George Floyd who deserve to have him alive today. I'm also thinking of all our black communities and other communities of color who say their children or their parents or themselves in George Floyd and Daunte Wright and Adam Toledo and Breonna Taylor and Laquan McDonald." Now, all of those names have been hallmarks of protests in Chicago. George Floyd, especially, his name last year, his face everywhere during massive demonstrations, as were some of his final words: "I can't breathe." Now, others here echoing what Maya again had said earlier, that conviction today of Derrick Chauvin would not have happened were it not for the widespread backlash against police brutality. Now, another hallmark of those large-scale protests, calls for change. George Floyd's murder was a flashpoint in Illinois and in Chicago, leading to a handful of new laws that were backed by black legislators, and most prominently, that includes a massive criminal justice bill that is now law. You had, of course, the Chauvin trial relying heavily on both video from bystanders, but also from the body cameras of police themselves. This new Illinois law requires all law enforcement in the state of Illinois to have and to use body cameras by the year 2025. Also includes provisions such as requiring that deaths in police custody be reported and tracked, use of force training, and it does also set protocols for crowd control and more. So activists at tonight's gathering say, yes, this is all a start, claiming victory with the thrice guilty verdict now facing Derrick Chauvin. But they also say again that they want more accountability, pointing out their frustrations, their anger with Adam Toledo, the death of Adam Toledo, the 13-year-old, at the hands of a Chicago police officer, even as the Chauvin trial was taking place. Paris, back to you.
And Amanda, we're going to talk to Alderman in just a bit about some of those police reform proposals and that meeting tomorrow in person. It'll be watched closely. All right, thanks very much. And now we turn to Phil Ponce for more on today's verdict. Phil.
Paris, as mentioned earlier, former Minneapolis police officer Derrick Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 counts.
We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict, count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. Verdict, count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty.
Last night we spoke with 2 attorneys who have dealt with police misconduct cases from both sides. And tonight they join us again with their reactions. James Montgomery, attorney with James D. Montgomery and Associates, who handles cases of police brutality. And Dan Herbert, attorney with the Herbert Law Firm. He represented former Chicago police officer Jason Van Dyke when he was on trial for the death of Laquan McDonald. Gentlemen, thank you again for joining us. And James Montgomery, very quickly, your reaction to today's verdict.
Delighted and surprised. Delighted because it is a precedent that I hope will be an indication that people will start to look at the facts and give the true results from those facts and promote justice for people. Surprised because my experience has been that if you have a number of Caucasian people on a jury and a police officer is at risk in a criminal prosecution, it is very difficult for them to find that person guilty. And so that I commend them, and I see that as a beacon of hope that in the future things may get better. That coupled with those folks who are out in the street expressing themselves and insisting that we have peace with justice.
Dan Herbert, your reaction to today's verdict?
I have a mixed reaction. I definitely believe that Derrick Chauvin is guilty of a crime, and I think that the jury properly found him guilty of a crime. But I have to comment that the process of this trial, I think that there was certainly a constitutional problem here, and that happened when Derrick Chauvin's request for a jury from a different county was denied. I mean, we had a courthouse that was surrounded by barbed wire, and there was military personnel and tanks on the scene. And for anyone to think that that didn't affect the jurors' decision-making, I think is naive.
James Montgomery, speaking of the jury was made up of 4 African Americans, 2 jurors who were self-identified as multiracial, and 6 white jurors. Impact on deliberations, say, for example, would it have made a difference if the jury had not been that diverse?
I think it could have made a difference. On the other hand, you must look at this case as being very unique. Unique in the sense that the visual effects of that video was so dramatic that it would be difficult for anybody to justify finding him innocent. So, yeah, I think that the diversity helps. In my career, I've always wanted at least one African American on the jury so there could be no open discussion of racism. And the more, the merrier. But the problem as I see it now is that we've got to make sure that we keep this movement going that these young people have started. I agree with Dan that, it affects the jury. It affects everybody. It affects the entire community. As we've indicated, it affects the entire world, as we've seen all over the world, that there have been demonstrations on this whole issue of George Floyd's murder.
Dan Herbert, is this a case that's limited to the specifics of its own facts, or do you think it has the potential to have an impact on police conduct or the criminal justice system in general?
I think that Derrick Chauvin's actions in this case have done more to drive a wedge in between the relationship between police and the communities in which they serve. I think that for the most part, the police community recognized that Derrick Chauvin's actions were absolutely uncalled for. So I think this case might be more of an aberration towards a meaningful effect on law enforcement, because I think everyone recognized what this case was.
James Montgomery, an aberration, or you alluded to the fact that you hope that this might be some kind of a turning point?
Hope, on the other hand, I can't disagree with Dan, because if you look at historically what has happened in this country is that police officers have a culture by which they disrespect black and brown people even disrespecting them to taking their lives or just running away from them. And if you think about it, you never read about police killing white people, nor do you hear about white people running from the police. They're not afraid of the police. The police are their friend. They preserve and protect them. The blacks, they surveil and harass them and disrespect them. So I don't think that this is going to be an overnight situation. It wasn't an overnight situation as it's come along. And as I see it, it is going to take a lot of cases like this. It is going to take a lot of $28 million settlements and costs that the city puts out before they think about it. What was happening here? This was Chauvin was the superior officer training younger officers in how to police. And that's why this system perpetuates itself. People like Chauvin training new recruits, indicating that this is okay to behave like he behaved.
Dan Herbert, we're just about out of time. I'll give you the last word on what people should take away from this case, in your view.
Well, for the record, James, when I was a kid, I did run from the police. But as far as this case goes, I think that, we recognize this. Like I said, this case was an aberration. The acts were horrible. They were hard to justify. But I do want to emphasize that point. I think what we need to take away from this case is that everyone, no matter how unpopular a defendant is required to get a fair trial. And there's no way that anyone can argue that a jury can render a decision based solely on the facts that are presented in the case when they have so much overwhelming evidence of fear and danger that could come to them as a result of an unpopular verdict. We have to recognize that fact.
That is the kind of thing that very well might come up on appeal, and we shall be watching. Dan Herbert, James Montgomery, thank you both so much for your insights.
You're very welcome. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
And now, Paris, we go back to you.
Thanks, Phil. Today's guilty verdict will no doubt have city leaders breathing a sigh of relief. Mayor Lightfoot yesterday called for National Guard backup in anticipation of big George Floyd demonstrations. This as the city is already on edge over last week's video release of the Adam Toledo shooting. And joining us to discuss the verdict and all other city business are Alderman Chris Taliaferro of the city's West Side 29th Ward, Alderman Byron Sigcho Lopez of the 25th Ward on the West Side, Alderman Rosana Rodriguez-Sanchez of the 33rd Ward on the Northwest Side, and Alderman Brian Hopkins of the 2nd Ward on the city's North Side. First, I want to get everyone's reaction to this verdict. Guilty on all 3 counts here of murder and manslaughter for Derrick Chauvin. Alderman Hopkins, your reaction.
Relief, as you said at the top of the segment, Paris, relief. We are not going to have to deal with the type of civil unrest that we were prepared to deal with had there been an acquittal. Or even a finding of guilt on 2 out of the 3 counts. I think the reaction still would have been the same. People are prepared to say the justice system worked, and I don't think we're going to see the kind of, outpouring of violence and rage that would have accompanied an acquittal.
Alderman Sigcho Lopez, is that the sentiment that the justice system has delivered in this case?
Well, it has delivered perhaps in this case, but one verdict cannot absolve or legitimize the whole system. As you know, we have many cases of police brutality, police misconduct. We have here the case of Adam Toledo. So we will continue to demand justice for all the cases, not only here in Chicago, for police accountability here and across the country.
Alderman Taliaferro, as a former police officer, your view of this verdict?
Well, I think, I expressed the same sentiment as my colleague, Alderman Hopkins. I am relieved, especially in light of the criticism, and I should say fair criticism, of our criminal justice system. And we're not all the way there yet. I mean, we do have a guilty verdict, but we have sentencing to look at, and we have to ensure that I should say that the sentence fits the crime. And so I am relieved, not just for the city of Chicago, but for the Floyd family as well.
That's right. The sentencing in 8 weeks, I'm sure that'll be closely watched as well. Alderman Rosana Rodriguez-Sanchez, your take on today's verdict.
I think it was the right verdict. I think that we have a lot of work to do to transform our ideas of public safety. We know that we have the Dante Wright case that is going to be coming up. Here in Chicago, we have Adam Toledo. We have the case of Anthony Alvarez that we don't even know anything about yet because COPA hasn't released any information. So we have to overhaul our idea of public safety.
So speaking of public safety, at least acutely right now, Alderman Sigcho Lopez, the mayor asked the governor to call in the National Guard. Do you believe that's the right move?
Well, I think especially now with the announcement of the verdict, we see Mayor Lightfoot continue to avoiding the real issue in the city of Chicago, which is police accountability. The calls for the National Guard do not solve the structural issues that we have in the city of Chicago. We do need the mayor to focus on the local issues. We need the mayor to focus on the bill for empowering communities for public safety in the city of Chicago, as well as relief. No more police repression, no more fear, no more terror in our communities. What we need is relief and accountability of the police department, and we need it now.
Alderman Hopkins, everyone remembers the unrest that happened last summer. Parts of your ward were hit really bad. Obviously, the mayor and other officials wanted to head that off. Given the tension right now, are you confident that police have a plan to keep your area safe and all areas safe?
Compared to 2020, 100%. It is a dramatic difference in terms of our preparation, our resources, our tactical training, everything. We didn't have that in 2020, and the results were obvious to all with those two horrific incidents of looting and widespread criminal vandalism in May and in August. We were caught completely unprepared. That problem has been corrected. But when you say, am I confident that it won't happen again, that's another matter entirely. You know, no one has a crystal ball. We don't know what the response will be. As Alderman Taliaferro mentioned, sentencing will be another issue. We have to prepare for that, and we are not done dealing with this yet. So we're trying to prepare as best we can. And the one lesson that we took away from the incidents in 2020 is that the best tactic is a preventive tactic. So that's why the National Guard is here. It serves as a disincentive to come downtown in large groups with the intent to commit acts of arson and looting. They're serving their purpose, and we think we will continue to deploy resources like that to try and dissuade people from engaging in that. First Amendment rights, absolutely. Protest and express your outrage, absolutely. Burn down a store, break a window, turn over a police car, no. Nothing justifies that. And we have, as a city, are obligated to try and prevent that activity from happening again, as it did on two dramatic occasions last year.
Alderman Taliaferro, I want to move over to the Adam Toledo case. Again, from your perspective, having been a police officer, and you saw that video release last week, that tragic video, what was your initial reaction to it?
Well, first let me say, Paris, that the Toledo family are still in my prayers, and my continued thoughts and prayers. Just everyone, I believe, it was horrific to even view that. Whether you've seen it in person or on video, it is damaging emotionally to see the death of a young man or anyone. But to see them dying in an alley on the street was very horrific, and it struck me. And words could not express how I felt after seeing it. And this is after having an extensive career as a police officer, where I've seen that happen time and time again. It just solidifies in me that no matter what your background may be, viewing a death is something that we shouldn't take lightly. And the loss of life is something that we shouldn't take lightly. So my prayers are out to the Toledo family for all that they're going through and all that they've been through and will go through continually.
Alderman Rodriguez-Sanchez, the CPD has made a case that that Toledo did have a gun on him, or what appeared to be a gun, and it was less than a second between what appears that he tosses the gun aside and then turns around and puts his hands up. Does that make this harder to prove that this is an unjustified police shooting here?
It was an execution. What we saw in that video was a child with his hands up. He was trying to comply with the orders that the police officer gave him. And to have seen how the city and the mayor spent 2 weeks making sure that people were absolutely confused about what was happening, that the character of that child was disparaged for 2 whole weeks, so that there was already a suspicion of culpability, and they engaging in so much victim blaming. It's been disgusting.
Alderman Hopkins, one of the things the mayor has said she wants to come out of this is a revision to the foot pursuit policy by the police. What do you think needs to change about that?
Well, we need to have one, for one thing. I actually just got a copy of ostensibly what passes for the current foot pursuit policy, and it doesn't really shed any light. It doesn't nearly go far enough to address the kinds of hazardous and dangerous situations that police officers face all the time, and making the decision whether or not to pursue an armed offender. There's so many variables that go into it. And now we've seen in very horrific and dramatic fashion the consequences of a lack of attention to tactical training and decision-making that police officers need to employ. Look, we could just pass a blanket ban and say, well, you know, we're just not going to chase criminals. I don't think that's the right thing to do either. I know some of my colleagues might differ, but I think we still have a society where there are dangerous people who need to be brought to justice. Police officers have to do that. That's their job. And as long as we're asking them to do that job, we have to support them. And one of the ways we support them is with proper training that will ensure situations like this don't happen. And I do agree with my colleague who just mentioned that Adam Toledo was attempting to surrender that night. He absolutely was. I have no doubt in my mind, having watched that video repeatedly, he slowed down, he stopped running, and he turned. Where I would differ with her, though, was absolutely not an execution. The police officer in that case had every reason to believe that there would be a gun in his hand as he raised his hand. He didn't know he was a 13-year-old, didn't know he was a middle schooler. He knew he had a gun, and as his arm came up in that less than a second, the police officer had no choice but to protect his own life so he could go home to his family. And he had to do what a horrible thing that was, and he has to live with the consequences of that as well.
This is a very, very intense case. We're going to have to leave it right there for now. But we'll be joined again by the alderman later in the show to discuss Chicago's COVID vaccine rollout, among other things. For now, our thanks to you all for joining us. Thanks so much. Up next, vibrant portraits on fabric at the Art Institute. So please stay with us. And there's much more ahead on the show tonight, including a look at how to combat rumors circulating on social media. But first, history and music and photography are all stitched together in a show at the Art Institute. Chicago Tonight visited the pandemic-delayed exhibition, and producer Mark Vitale has the story behind these Technicolor textiles.
They may look like paintings or photographs, but they are quilts inspired by documentary photos from the Library of Congress and family snapshots. We spoke with the artist from her home studio in New Jersey.
It's like walking through a family photo album that was life-size. I like the idea that we're seeing them and they're also seeing us. And we're looking at them from whatever time they came from. Some of my photos could have been taken from the 1850s or the 1940s. And they're looking back at us in our time.
Lisa Butler and her husband, a longtime DJ, curated a Spotify playlist of songs to complement each artwork. And she adds notes of visual elegance to her subjects.
I'm looking at people during World War II, a lot of the photos that are in the exhibit. And Black people in the South and in the Midwest were struggling. And so sometimes their clothing is worn and frayed, or sometimes they don't have on shoes, or the hat could be torn. And because I'm sewing in my nature, I feel compelled that I have to fix those things. Need a little help, y'all. Yes, please. Need a little help. My mom and my grandmother taught me to sew. My mother was a French teacher and my grandmother was a homemaker, but they were always trying to make replica Christian Dior gowns or replica Halston. I think about myself being like one in the succession of this long line of quilters. And that's one thing that I really love about quilting, that it grounds you in this history of women creating.
Now, Butler's modern works are installed in galleries usually reserved for centuries-old European painting and sculpture.
It's mind-blowing having my installation above that grand staircase. It's been trippy and wonderful.
We asked an Art Institute textile curator for her take on the artwork.
There really is a very sculptural quality, and even in many of them a sense of motion. You can notice it particularly in the faces and in the hands, and you'll see really too an evolution of her practice in the works in the exhibition, where you can see how she's adding additional layers and stitching more to really create these sculptural effects.
Bisa Butler also pays tribute to Afra Cobra, the influential Chicago art collective that emerged in the 1960s.
I went to Howard University, and our professors in the painting faculty mostly came from the Afra Cobra group. And they basically represented, I would say, one of the visual artistic arms of the Black Power movement. The philosophies that they had was that artists' work should reflect the community. You know, I hope that my work can inform and educate people, and also speak to people's sensibility of looking into each person as they pass as a real human being who deserves respect and recognition, just the same way you would look at a piece of artwork.
For Chicago Tonight, this is Mark Vitale.
And Bisa Butler's show is on view at the Art Institute of Chicago through September 6th. And her artwork is currently projected onto the Merchandise Mart each evening as part of the Art on the Mart series. And still to come on Chicago Tonight, calls for accountability after police fatally shoot Adam Toledo. We talk with City Council members about a police misconduct ordinance. As Mayor Lightfoot shoots down rumors burning up on social media, we talk about how to combat misinformation. And we look at how music venues are surviving after more than a year of shutdown and a recent rollout of a federal aid program dedicated to them. But first, our top story tonight. Former Minneapolis police officer Derrick Chauvin has been found guilty on all charges related to the murder of George Floyd. Chauvin, who kept his knee on Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes, long after Floyd had no longer had a pulse, showed little emotion today as the verdicts were read in court. He was found guilty of second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter, and now faces up to 40 years in prison. Sentencing is set to take place in about 8 weeks. The top official at the Illinois State Board of Elections is retiring. This after going on administrative leave following what election officials say was an extortion attempt against him. Stephen Sandvoss has served on the board for more than 3 decades and as executive director since 2015. Election officials have not given specifics on the extortion attempt, but say that no voter data was compromised. Early in the program, we discussed the guilty verdict in the Chauvin trial and the video of Chicago police fatally shooting 13-year-old Adam Toledo. And now we're joined again by City Council members Chris Taliaferro, Byron Sigcho Lopez, Rosanna Rodriguez Sanchez, and Brian Hopkins. I want to pick up the police discussion again. Alderman Sigcho Lopez, we know that there are different police oversight proposals, civilian oversight proposals that have been merged into one now. The mayor has been opposed to various aspects of it. Bottom line, will a final version of police oversight give that panel the ability to hire and fire the police superintendent?
But we've seen time after time the mayor talking about independent reviews, which don't exist. And we have to be frank about this. We have to be honest that in the city of Chicago right now, we do not have independent reviews and independent investigations. That's what we're demanding.
So you're saying the current police board and COPA, you're saying those are not independent reviews?
Certainly. I think that right now, if you look at the facts, the fact of the matter is, in this case of Adam Toledo in particular, we've seen is the version of CPD that went all the way to the state's attorney's office. A state's attorney that now is backtracking the original comments because of the version of the Chicago Police Department. And something that we are now supporting is also an investigation with other Latino lawyers for an investigation of the Department of Justice, because we do not have independent review. We have a bill empowering communities of public safety. We need a vote, and we need to pass that for the safety of our children that continue to die in the hands of police, of communities, and of course, a larger comprehensive view to invest in our communities, in our schools, in youth programming to prevent violence. I agree with my colleagues. It is about prevention, but it's also about accountability.
All right, Alderman Taliaferro, the Inspector General Joe Ferguson appeared before City Council and pretty angrily asked them to pass an ordinance that would create a public database of police misconduct files going back to 1994. You sponsored such an ordinance, and now it appears that you have second thoughts about that. How come?
No, I don't, Paris. I don't have second thoughts about that. Alderman Scott Waguespack and myself co-sponsored the ordinance that would actually bring that into fruition. What I differ from the that we have to make sure that we are not overburdening the taxpayers and the city with time and going back to a time frame in which is unnecessary. I believe that anything relevant to, from the year 2000 and on toward the present is very relevant as with regard to police investigation, or to a time frame in which their current police officers serving from the late 90s. But to go back 30, 40 years, I believe that's can be overburdening on the taxpayers.
So you would support this ordinance if it didn't go back that many years?
I actually support the ordinance. That's why I co-sponsored it with my colleague. Right. I believe in transparency, and that requires us to make sure that this database is available to the public with regard to police. Can I say just one more thing, Paris, and I'll be very short with it. I also want to make sure that we are making sure that complaint register numbers are available to the public and not necessary log numbers are available. A log number is not an investigation against a police officer. Once it's been upgraded to an investigation, I believe all of those should be available.
All right, Alderman Hopkins, we talk about police reform while the city is experiencing another spike in homicides over last year, a spike in vehicular hijacking. I'm curious, is there any evidence that tells you there's a connection between kids who have not been in school, at least physically in school for the most of the last year, and these higher crime numbers we're seeing?
I'm not aware of any evidence. I'm aware of a lot of anecdotal stories and people who really think there's a connection. Clearly, our youth are being harmed. They're, as we all are. You know, the effects of the pandemic have been devastating to the emotional well-being and to the mental health of Chicagoans of all ages, not just our youth and not just our families. And we're going to be dealing with the effects of that for quite a long time. I think that's going to be one of the challenges going forward, where, you know, the mayor has committed to bringing additional mental health resources to our schools. We need them now more than ever. And that will be something that will help bring young people back in off the street. And to the extent that there has been some damage that have been done to their psyches over the last year, we can begin repairing it once schools are fully functional once again.
All right, Alderman Rodriguez-Sanchez, I have to pivot over to COVID here. The city is going to get about $2 billion in federal COVID relief funding. You heard the mayor saying that she's going to use about half of that to pay off some risky debt the city took to balance the last 2 years' budget. Is that the right move?
I think that our communities are hurting. I think that the rollout for the vaccine has put our communities in a very delicate place, and people are vulnerable. We need to do everything that we can to get people vaccinated. In my ward, I've been trying to set up a vaccine clinic. I have to work with Jewel Osco in order to do that, and they haven't even responded to my messages. How is it possible that we are not being able to make it easy for people to get vaccinated? We are still struggling with feeding people in the city of Chicago. We have a lottery for rental assistance. All of that funding is coming in, but we definitely need to do more for our communities. I sure hope that none of that money is going to end up reimbursing police for any reason.
Alderman Taliaferro, I'll pose that question to you as well. $2 billion, I mean, it's a good problem to have, but it is a problem when you're going to have 50 people in city council that perhaps believe the money should be spent one way or another. Is spending half of that on paying off debt the right move?
I can tell you this, you're gonna have all 50 of my colleagues, well, 49 of my colleagues, I'm the 50th, but all of us are gonna say that we want to see a lot of that funds go toward community support. We want affordable housing, or we want homelessness to be eradicated. We want a lot of these funds to go toward that. But we also, in looking at what would better our communities, we also have to make sure that we're looking at city debt. If we continue to carry a load of city debt, guess what happens to property taxes? Property taxes are gonna have to be increased. That's going to affect our families even more. So if we could get rid of debt and take care of our families and in our communities and the residents of the city, I'm willing to listen to that proposal as well. I won't completely say it's a bad proposal, but if it will support our families without increasing property taxes because we're paying off debt, and we could go in and support our families and our businesses with this relief fund, I'm all for it. I'm willing to listen to it.
All right, a lot of issues that you all are juggling. We appreciate your time here with us. Our thanks to Alderman Chris Taliaferro, Byron Sigcho-Lopez, Rosana Rodriguez-Sanchez, and Brian Hopkins. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paris.
Over the weekend, rumors were burning up social media that would reportedly lead to the resignation of Mayor Lori Lightfoot. The mayor responded to those rumors on Twitter and at a news conference yesterday. Take a look.
Certainly it's disappointing. That's something that's so salacious and false and goes against everything and who I am, that some of you took seriously and were trying to chase down sourcing for. But I'll just share my exchange with my 13-year-old. We were explaining to her and felt a need to explain to her because some of you put her in your mouths. She said, "Why are people so stupid and mean?"
And here to talk about how rumors spread on social media and how journalists should cover them are Peter Adams, the Senior Vice President of Education at the News Literacy Project. That's a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that teaches students how to know what to believe in the digital age. And Charles Whitaker, Dean of Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism. Welcome, both of you, gentlemen. Peter, this is what you do at the News Literacy Project, try to teach people how to fact check and trust what they see. When you see something like this, so many people believe these rumors simply because they were spread far and wide on social media. So how do you go about combating it when it spreads so fast like that?
Indeed, I think the first step is to actually just slow down and to be aware of your emotions. So I think this spread very quickly, especially among the mayor's critics, who maybe leaned into that information, engaged in a little confirmation bias, and didn't really scrutinize or question the source of the information or take a look at the evidence. So if we just slow down, try to figure out where the information is coming from, and don't fall for things like screenshots of anonymous social media posts, we'll all be a lot better off.
And confirmation bias comes into play so often on so many issues as people seek out information. Charles Whitaker, as a journalist, you know, clearly you are a little bit curious as to whether there's some truth to this. So how does a journalist go about trying to dig into this without amplifying baseless misinformation on social media?
I think we track it down the same way we would if we were reporting on any other story. I think Peter's absolutely right. We have to slow things down. We have to apply the same standards of verification and accuracy that we do through traditional media. But too often, people treat social media as though it's not journalism. When you are working as a journalist and you are repeating rumor, that's journalistic malpractice. You actually should be applying the same standards that you do in your normal beat coverage.
And Peter, you know, there's been a lot written about the case of Adam Toledo here in Chicago, and perhaps journalists going with the Chicago Police Department's initial explanation of what happened when you see the video and it was different from what they said. How about that? How do journalists handle a situation like that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of thoughtful conversations happening now in newsrooms and you know, a much needed sort of revisiting of practices around how official statements are reported. I think in the initial coverage of the shooting, we saw a lot of amplification of official statements. What we know now to be a false statement that Toledo had a gun was just amplified in a headline. And, you know, I think even if it's attributed to officials, even if it's attributed to police, it lends it credence. And so I think news organizations need to continue this work of being more thoughtful and more skeptical about the initial information released by police. We're seeing that today in the wake of the Derrick Chauvin verdict. People revisiting the initial statements about George Floyd's death.
Indeed, the initial statements from the Minneapolis PD about that were vastly different from what actually happened. So, Charles Whitaker, what should newsrooms do when the police or public officials put out a statement and there's this track record here of perhaps not comporting with the truth?
I think, as Peter said, we can't take the quote, official version of events as the accurate version of events, and we have to reserve judgment. It's not just enough to say that it was the official version of the events. I think we have to, as best we can, attempt to verify, wait for video coverage. And that's, you know, anathema to what we think we should do. But we can't sacrifice expedience and being the first ones to the story for accuracy. And then when we're wrong, we've actually got to own up to that and sort of say where those mistakes occurred and how they occurred.
And Peter Adams, it's no secret right now that social media companies like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube are super spreaders of misinformation, and so much of the public is confused about what is truth, what is credible journalism, what are memes, what are hot takes. Simply put, can social media companies do more than they're doing? Do they have the capacity to do more to root out misinformation?
Absolutely, they have more capacity. I think they can, you know, they can do a number of things. They have, you know, substantial, astronomical resources in some cases to devote to this, and aren't doing enough there. But they're also not opening their platforms up enough for researchers, opening up their API and their data to researchers who are trying to figure out how disinformation agents and bad actors work online, how they network online. And then finally, I think, you know, they can go further. I think there are some steps in the right direction in terms of regarding public figures differently than private citizens. And I think that we should see a difference in the community standards to which people are held. People with large followings, influencers on platforms, should be held to a higher standard when it comes to the accuracy of content, and the consequences for them spreading harmful information should be more severe than an average user.
And Charles Whitaker, sometimes the harmful information or personalities spreading stuff in bad faith gets more clicks, it builds their brand, and sometimes it's hard for actual journalism to compete with that. So how does journalism win over the hearts and minds of folks that want salacious information?
Well, I think we can't succumb to the desire for clicks, you know, falling into the trap of just producing salacious information for clickbait will be the death of media. That's what contributes to the lack of trust that we are experiencing now. We have to hold ourselves to higher standards. I know it's a competitive environment, and we are all, you know, searching for eyeballs, but if the public doesn't trust us, if they come to believe that that we are no better than the fake news propagators, then that too will be the death of journalism.
And a lot of times, a lot of the public just can't tell the difference, which I know both of you care about this issue very much, and so do we. We want to keep talking about this down the road. But for now, our thanks to Peter Adams and Charles Whitaker.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
And up next, checking in with some of Chicago's music venues. But first, we take a look at the weather. There is light at the end of the COVID tunnel, but music lovers would still like to know, when will we be able to congregate at our favorite ornate theater or grungy little music hall to hear a concert? Under current Phase 4 guidelines, larger venues must stay at 50% or 50% occupancy, while smaller venues are at 25% or 25% occupancy, whichever is less. And a recent bungled federal aid rollout worth $16 billion for music venues and theaters is adding more strain to a stressful situation. Joining us are Robert Gomez, owner of the music venues Subterranean and Beat Kitchen, Eric Williams, founder of the retail and creative space Silver Room, which hosts the Sound System Block Party every summer, and Chris Bauman, owner of the Avondale Music Hall and Patio Theater. Good to see all of you back again. So Robert, first with you, the $16 billion fund from the SBA, it has not delivered the funding to music venues and theaters as it has promised quite yet. What's gone wrong?
Well, we all got in when they told us to jump on. Actually, we were supposed to get an email letting us know it was open, and we're already on a website. When we went live, we all applied, and no one was able to complete it and get in. So it was an incredible experience. One of the members of our group joked that it was the worst opening ever seen.
And you know, you're coming in and out a little bit there with your audio. Chris, I mean, how dependent are music venues on this funding? They've survived, the ones that are still around, they've survived a year dark. How badly needed is this funding?
Yeah, so Paris, first, thanks for having us. It is desperately needed. I've been comparing what my colleague Gomez was just talking about in terms of us trying to apply to similar to a boat sinking and everyone trying to get off the boat. That's how it was, everyone trying to get into this application, that type of desperation trying to get into this application. Look, it's been 14 months almost that we've been shut down. We're not going to be able to open up at full capacity. It looks for, you know, many months to come. We really need these funds to get going. We can't be capitalized. Banks won't touch us. The government's really our only outsource for these funds.
And Eric, at the Silver Room, you usually host the Sound System Block Party, which is 40,000 folks or so attending every year. You just made the decision to cancel that. When do you think you're going to see live events at your place?
Well, right now we've kind of put a hold on all live events until we can get back to 100% capacity, which, who knows, as everyone else said, maybe the end of summer. You know, as far as doing large scale events, it's going to be hard to distance. So again, until we can really do it the right way, I don't think you can do it halfway. We're going to just wait probably until next year, honestly.
Robert, is that what you're looking at your places, subterranean? I mean, with 50% allowed, is it just not enough to be able to make ends meet, to have bands come in and pay them and pay all the workers?
Well, there are more restrictions than just 50%, right? There's up to 50 people. And the bigger issue for us is the social distancing and seated. And that just does not work in a concert setting. As one of my colleagues always described us, as we're the opposite of social distancing.
Chris, what about live stream? Some venues have turned to live streaming. The Green Mill did it. Other venues have tried to do that to make money. Has that been any kind of lucrative deal for music venues to just stay afloat?
Yeah, you know what, Paris, it has not been a lucrative deal. It's been a good psychological deal just to make sure that we can still have music getting out there to people, but financially it's just not sustainable. You know, we have large buildings, large tax bills, large mortgages, live streaming. I think one of our colleagues describes as a river of pennies. It just does not make it happen at the end of the day. It's good morally, and a lot of us have done it morally. We did a great live stream through Civil called Civilization, where we went to numerous venues throughout the city.
And Civil is the group of independent music owners that got together and banded together. I was just explaining that for the viewers, but go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. I think we're up to about 30 independent Chicago venues are part of Civil. And we all came together, and many of us were able to live stream a virtual festival, which was great for morale. We raised money for our staffs and things like that. But really, live streaming just financially does not cut it at the end of the day.
Eric Williams, we mentioned earlier, you can't have your 40,000 person outdoor event that you usually have, the sound system event. Can you move some of your normal programming outside when the weather gets good, and can that help your business out?
Maybe some smaller events, but again, as Gomez said, you know, doing events and being outside in the summer is about being together. And it's going to be really difficult to do something that's going to be substantial, I think, in the summer if you're talking about cutting capacity. So we might just do some smaller things when it makes sense and when it's safe.
Robert or Chris, I'm hearing that the Wicker Park Fest might take place. That's a pretty large outdoor event. How is that going to be programmed if we're not in a full reopen mode here in Illinois?
Well, if we're not in full reopen mode, we won't do it. We have to plan this very carefully with a easy exit strategy. We aren't able to hold off and remain everyone safe.
So that just is contingent on getting to the full reopen. Chris, there's a lot of controversy over the thought of vaccine passports. Do you think music venues, to be able to feel comfortable and do business, would require folks to show proof of vaccination to come to a concert?
That's a conversation that's gone back and forth. I think we're taking every precaution to make sure that when people do and are able to come back out to our venues, that it is safe. We want to make sure that you're going to be able to come see a concert very similar to when you did before in 2019. And that is our goal, to get to that point, get to 100% capacity. And we're taking precautions in terms of making sure that there's plenty of sanitation, making sure that everyone is responsible when it comes to our staffing and things of that nature. And we just really want to be able to open our doors when it is safe to do so again, is our goal.
And when you do, I will be in all of your venues and every music venue in the city every night of the week, because I've really been missing live music, as I know all of you have. And our thanks to Robert Gomez, Eric Williams, and Chris Bauman. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Paris. Appreciate it.
And that's our show for this Tuesday night. Don't forget to stay connected with us by signing up for our daily briefing. And you can get Chicago Tonight streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and our website, WTTW.com/news. You can also get the show via podcast and the PBS video app. And please join us tomorrow night, live at 7. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz. We leave you now with more artwork from Bisa Butler. Thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a great night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois leading lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.